In the quiet town of Ridgeport, Ohio, the shocking disappearance of lottery winner Thomas Weller in 2000 left everyone haunted for decades. His ambitious cousin Michael Weller and Michael's cunning wife Cynthia Graves were among those questioned but never charged. 20 years later, determined detective Laura Finch reopened the forgotten case, uncovering chilling secrets that had been buried with time. What began as a tale of fortune and fame spiraled into a dark web of greed, betrayal, and murder, ending with the arrest of the woman no one suspected. Ridgeport's long-cold mystery was about to explode back into the light. In the summer of 2000, the town of Ridgeport, Ohio, buzzed with excitement as news spread that a local factory worker had won the state lottery. His name was Thomas Weller, a 34-year-old man who had spent most of his life working long shifts at the steel plant just outside of town. For years he lived quietly in a rented apartment, known to everyone as polite, hardworking, and always ready to lend a hand. When his lucky ticket turned out to be worth millions, Thomas became an overnight celebrity. Reporters filled his yard, neighbors brought him gifts, and cameras followed his every move. It was a story straight out of a dream, an ordinary man who struck gold and changed his life forever. Despite the sudden wealth, Thomas didn't seem like the kind of person who would let money change him. He continued driving his old pickup truck and wearing the same work boots he'd owned for years. He often told friends that he wanted to do good things with his winnings, help his family, donate to the local church, and give back to the town that had supported him. Within a few months, he bought a new house on the edge of Ridgeport, a wide white bricked home with tall gates and a garden that quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. But along with the excitement came attention he hadn't expected. Strangers began visiting uninvited, some claiming to be distant relatives, others asking for money or investment opportunities. At first, Thomas handled the attention with patience. He was kind-hearted and rarely said no, which made him easy to approach. But as time passed, his generosity began to wear him down. Friends noticed a change in him. He became more withdrawn, quieter, and often looked worried. There were whispers that people close to him were taking advantage of his kindness. Some said family members had begun arguing over how much he owed them. Others claimed he had received threatening letters demanding money. No one knew what was true, but the easy smile Thomas once carried began to fade. Then, on a cold November evening, everything changed. Thomas was last seen leaving his house just after sunset. He told his housekeeper he had an errand to run and would be back soon, but he never returned. The next morning, his car was discovered abandoned on a narrow road near a wooded area outside town. The keys were still in the ignition, and his jacket was folded neatly on the passenger seat. Inside the glove compartment was his wallet, filled with cash and credit cards. Nothing seemed stolen, yet Thomas was gone. Police began an immediate search, combing through the woods and nearby rivers, but there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, and no clues pointing to where he went. The mansion stood eerily silent, its tall windows reflecting the empty road. For the people of Ridgeport, the joy that had surrounded Thomas's life turned to confusion and fear. A man who had everything simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense that something far darker had taken place. In the days after Thomas Weller's disappearance, Ridgeport was flooded with search parties and media vans. Police scoured every inch of the forest where his car had been found. Volunteers combed through the thick underbrush, while helicopters circled overhead. Divers searched nearby lakes, hoping for any sign of his body. Yet day after day, nothing surfaced. It was as if Thomas had simply vanished from the earth. The hope that he might return alive began to fade, replaced by rumors and suspicion. People whispered theories in grocery stores and diners, each story wilder than the last. Some believed he had staged his disappearance to escape the pressures of fame, while others were convinced he had been murdered for his fortune. Investigators started to dig into his financial records. They discovered that despite his millions, Thomas had barely touched his lottery winnings. His accounts were still full. No suspicious withdrawals, no hidden transfers, no sudden spending sprees. His expensive new mansion was paid for in full, and there was no evidence he had been planning to leave. Police questioned his friends, neighbors, and family members one by one. Most described him as a good man who had grown cautious in his final weeks, mentioning that he no longer trusted everyone around him. Still, no one could name a single person who might want to hurt him. Attention soon turned to his relatives. His sudden wealth had caused friction within the family, especially with his cousin, Michael Weller. Court documents later revealed that Thomas had refused to share his winnings with several relatives, insisting that the money should be used for charity and his own modest plans. Behind closed doors, resentment grew. Witnesses recalled heated arguments at family gatherings, and one neighbor claimed to have overheard shouting from the mansion a week before Thomas went missing. Police interviewed Michael and his wife, Cynthia Graves, but without solid evidence, they were released. As the months dragged on, leads dried up. A few people came forward claiming to have seen Thomas in other states, but each sighting turned out false. A psychic from a nearby town even offered her services, insisting she could sense his spirit near the woods. But nothing she said helped the investigation. The public's interest began to fade as other stories filled the news. For the detectives, frustration set in. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no motive they could prove. By late 2001, the case file was officially marked unsolved. The boxes of evidence were sealed and placed in storage, joining countless other cold cases that had lost momentum. Over the next few years, the mansion was sold. The property changed hands, and the story of Ridgeport's missing millionaire became a legend told to newcomers. To some, Thomas Weller became a cautionary tale about greed and luck. To others, he was a mystery frozen in time. The man who had once inspired the town was now a ghost in its history, remembered only by the haunting silence of the forest where his car was left behind. 20 years passed before anyone mentioned Thomas Weller's name again in Ridgeport. The town had moved on, the mansion now repainted and occupied by new owners. The forest where his car was found slowly reclaiming the road with wild grass. The cold case sat buried in dusty police archives, thought to be beyond solving. Then, in early 2020, a young detective named Laura Finch joined the Ridgeport Police Department. She was ambitious, methodical, and fascinated by unsolved mysteries. During a review of old files, she came across the Weller case. The story of a man who had won millions only to disappear without a trace caught her attention immediately. What intrigued her most was how little evidence there was. No suspects, no physical clues, just unanswered questions. Laura began re-examining the original reports, reading every interview and reviewing the old photographs. Something about the crime scene bothered her. The car, she noticed, had been left neatly by the side of the road, and Thomas's jacket had been carefully folded on the seat. It didn't look like a struggle or a robbery. Instead, it looked staged, too orderly for someone who had been kidnapped or attacked. This small detail reignited her curiosity. She decided to reopen the investigation quietly, starting by re-interviewing anyone still alive who had known Thomas before he vanished. One of her first visits was to the retired officer who had led the original investigation, Frank Delaney. He was now in his 70s, his memory slower but still sharp. Frank admitted that back then, they had suspected someone close to Thomas but lacked proof. He recalled that a woman named Cynthia Graves had come up several times in conversation. Cynthia had been the wife of Thomas's cousin, Michael. She was described as charming but manipulative, someone who enjoyed the lifestyle that came with wealth. Rumors at the time hinted that she had grown resentful after Thomas refused to share his winnings. But again, there had been nothing to tie her directly to the crime. Laura's curiosity deepened. She began searching public records for Cynthia Graves, and was surprised to find a new name, Cynthia Miller. It seemed she had remarried and moved to another state. Even more interesting was that her second husband had died mysteriously in 2008, leaving behind a large life insurance payout. A pattern started to emerge. When Laura cross-referenced Cynthia's financial history, she noticed several sudden windfalls over the years, each following the death or disappearance of someone close to her. The more Laura dug, the stranger the story became. She tracked down old neighbors who remembered seeing Cynthia visiting Thomas shortly before he vanished. One recalled a heated argument outside the mansion. Another mentioned seeing her car parked near the woods that same night. These details had been ignored in the original case, considered unimportant at the time. But for Laura, they were the missing pieces of a much larger puzzle. She began to suspect that Thomas's disappearance was not about greed alone, but about revenge, betrayal, and a calculated plan that had gone unnoticed for 2 decades. Laura Finch knew she was treading carefully. Cold cases were fragile, and old witnesses often remembered less than they once had. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Cynthia Graves, now Cynthia Miller, was the key. The timeline fit too perfectly. Cynthia had last been seen near Thomas's property days before he vanished, and her sudden financial gains over the years hinted at something much darker beneath her calm, polished image. Laura decided to dig deeper into Cynthia's new life. She discovered that Cynthia was now living in Arizona, working as a real estate agent, respected and seemingly ordinary. On the surface, she had built a perfect life. But behind that success, Laura sensed secrets waiting to resurface. She requested a warrant to reopen the forensic evidence from the original investigation. When the old boxes arrived, covered in dust and age, Laura felt a thrill of anticipation. Among the items was a sealed envelope that contained a strand of hair found in Thomas Weller's car. Back in 2000, DNA testing had been limited and inconclusive, but technology had advanced since then. Laura sent the hair to the state lab for reanalysis, unsure what to expect. Weeks passed before the results returned, and when they did, her suspicions were confirmed. The hair belonged to Cynthia Graves. It was the first solid connection linking Cynthia to Thomas's disappearance. Yet even with that evidence, there were still no remains, no murder weapon, and no witnesses. To build a case, Laura needed more. She began tracing Cynthia's movements during the days following Thomas's disappearance. Bank records revealed a small but telling clue: a cash deposit made at an ATM in another town the morning after Thomas went missing. The amount wasn't huge, but it matched the sum withdrawn from Thomas's account just before he vanished. Police had missed it in the original investigation because it was recorded under an alias Cynthia used briefly before remarrying. Encouraged, Laura flew to Arizona to confront the woman she now believed had gotten away with murder for 20 years. When she first saw Cynthia, she was stunned by how composed she appeared, silver-haired, elegant, her tone calm and polite. Cynthia seemed to have crafted a new identity so convincingly that few would ever suspect her of violence. Laura introduced herself as a detective reviewing an old missing persons case and asked if she remembered Thomas Weller. Cynthia smiled faintly, claiming she hadn't seen him in decades and barely knew him. But as Laura asked more questions, she noticed small cracks in Cynthia's composure, a slight tremor in her hand, a flicker in her eyes when Thomas's name was mentioned. After returning to Ohio, Laura secured permission to conduct a search of the property Cynthia once owned with her first husband, Michael. Behind the house stood an old well long sealed with concrete. For years it had been overlooked, but ground-penetrating radar soon revealed something buried beneath it: objects consistent with human remains. When the well was excavated, investigators uncovered what was left of Thomas Weller. The mystery that had haunted Ridgeport for 2 decades was finally unraveling, and at its center stood the woman who had fooled everyone. The discovery of Thomas Weller's remains beneath Cynthia Graves's old property sent shockwaves through Ridgeport. News outlets from across the country flooded the small town, reviving a story long thought buried in time. The man who had once been celebrated as a humble millionaire had finally been found, and the woman connected to him, now living a new life as Cynthia Miller, was suddenly under nationwide scrutiny. For Detective Laura Finch, the revelation was both thrilling and heavy. She had reopened a forgotten chapter of local history, but she also knew that bringing justice after 20 years would not be simple. Forensic experts confirmed through DNA that the remains were indeed Thomas's. Alongside the bones were fragments of fabric from the same shirt he was last seen wearing and a small gold wristwatch, engraved with his initials. The evidence was undeniable. Investigators reconstructed the likely scenario. Thomas had been lured to the property under false pretenses, attacked, and hidden in the sealed well before anyone noticed he was missing. The meticulous way the body was concealed explained why no one had ever found it. Cynthia had covered her tracks almost perfectly. Laura immediately coordinated with Arizona authorities to arrest Cynthia Miller. When officers arrived at her home, she didn't resist. She appeared calm, even detached, as if she had been expecting the knock on her door. Neighbors watched in disbelief as she was led away in handcuffs, wearing a simple gray cardigan and sunglasses. The woman they knew as a generous, well-spoken real estate agent was now accused of murder. During questioning, Cynthia denied everything. She claimed she had been framed, insisting she had nothing to do with Thomas's disappearance. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Her DNA in his car, financial traces linking her to stolen funds, and now the discovery of his body on her former property. As the trial began, more unsettling details surfaced. Prosecutors presented testimony from acquaintances who said Cynthia often spoke bitterly about Thomas after he refused to share his lottery winnings. A forensic accountant revealed that shortly after Thomas vanished, Cynthia and her husband had quietly purchased luxury items and property far beyond their reported income. It became clear that the murder had been planned, not in anger, but in cold calculation. Cynthia and Michael had wanted Thomas's fortune, and when he refused, they decided to take it by force. The jury deliberated for only 2 days before reaching a verdict. Cynthia Miller was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michael Weller, her ex-husband, had died years earlier, leaving her to face justice alone. As the judge read the sentence, Cynthia remained expressionless, staring straight ahead, as if detached from her own fate. When the case finally closed, Ridgeport felt a mix of sorrow and relief. Thomas Weller's family buried him properly, 2 decades late but with peace at last. Detective Laura Finch stood at the edge of the service, watching quietly. She knew this case would haunt her career. The story of a man whose kindness was met with betrayal, and a woman whose greed had destroyed everything she touched. Ridgeport would never forget the name. Thomas Weller again. The story of Thomas Weller's disappearance became one of Ridgeport's darkest legends, a tale where fortune turned into tragedy, and greed buried the truth for 2 long decades. What began as the dream of an honest man who struck luck ended in betrayal by the very people he trusted most. Cynthia Graves and Michael Weller believed their crime would remain hidden forever, but time and persistence proved otherwise. Detective Laura Finch's determination brought light to a mystery long thought unsolvable. In the end, justice prevailed, reminding everyone that even the deepest secrets eventually rise to the surface, no matter how carefully they're buried. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life-inspired true crime mysteries. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chilling case where truth finally catches up with time. Your support helps uncover more forgotten stories, because in the world of crime, justice delayed is never justice denied.